In the quiet aftermath of war, long after the bombs stop falling and the flags are folded away, there are still places where the silence feels unnatural, where the air itself holds its breath, where something unspeakable happened and was never fully acknowledged. Near the city of Harbin, in northeastern China, there's such a place. Its soil remembers what the world tried to forget. Concrete foundations half buried in weeds, rusting gates that once marked the edge of hell. A museum now stands where science and cruelty became one. It is not one of the most visited sites of World War II history. There are no triumphant stories here, no glory, no redemption, only shadows. You are watching History's Shadow, and this is the story of Unit 731, a place where doctors became executioners, and the pursuit of knowledge became a justification for inhumanity. Not a battlefield, but a laboratory. Not war, but something colder, more deliberate. In this episode, we walk into the darkness, not because we want to, but because someone must. To understand the birth of Unit 731, we must first understand the dream that gave it life, and the empire willing to sacrifice anything to achieve it. It was the early 1930s. Japan stood at a crossroads, industrialized, militarized, and hungry for more. The world's great powers were reeling from the Great Depression, but Japan saw an opportunity. In 1931, without warning or international approval, Japanese forces staged an explosion on a railway in Manchuria and blamed Chinese saboteurs. It was a false flag, designed to justify invasion. Within months, the Japanese Kwantung Army seized the territory and established a puppet state called Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the action. Japan walked out of the League, a signal to the world. It would not be restrained, and what followed would be nothing short of imperial conquest. But behind the military parades and propaganda films, something darker was forming in the shadows. One man, a brilliant and ambitious army surgeon named Shirō Ishii, saw the conquest of Manchuria not just as a military victory, but as a blank canvas. A place where he could build a new kind of weapon, one that required no gunpowder or steel, a weapon of microbes, of disease, of death without sound. With full support from Tokyo, Ishii proposed a research program cloaked in the name of public health, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. It sounded benign, helpful even. But the truth would become one of the most horrifying chapters in modern history. Every atrocity has a mastermind. Shirō Ishii was not a madman in the traditional sense. He didn't rant, didn't rave. He was articulate, ambitious, charming even, to those who needed convincing. A golden boy of Japan's military medical corps, Ishii believed deeply in the potential of biological warfare. He was also obsessed with legacy. He wanted to be remembered, not just as a soldier or a doctor, but as a pioneer. He studied at Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's top institutions. While other students dissected frogs, Ishii was studying pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and the science of infection. But he didn't just want to study disease. He wanted to weaponize it. To Ishii, microbes were the future of combat. Invisible, incurable, indiscriminate. He saw them as the ultimate equalizer, a way to strike terror into enemies without risking armies. And he wasn't alone. High-ranking officials in the Imperial Japanese Army saw in Ishii a useful tool. Brilliant, nationalistic, and willing to work in silence, they gave him funds, they gave him men, and most dangerously, they gave him freedom. In 1936, deep in the fields outside Harbin, construction began. A fortress disguised as a research facility. A labyrinth of brick and steel that would soon become a house of horrors. The name, Unit 731. To the public, it was a center for disease prevention. Inside, it was something else entirely. A place where morality and medicine were violently divorced. Where science was used not to heal, but to hurt. And at the heart of it stood Shirō Ishii, wearing the mask of a man of science, but hiding something far more sinister beneath. The complex rose slowly at first, brick by brick, wire by wire, nestled in the flatlands near Harbin. But its true architecture was hidden not in the walls, but in what it wasn't allowed to be seen. Spanning over 6 square kilometers, Unit 731 was more than a laboratory. It was a self-contained world of secrecy. Behind electrified fences and watchtowers, it housed everything necessary to wage a hidden war. Biological labs disguised as water research facilities, animal testing chambers soon adapted for humans, a prison block where no names were recorded, crematoria where evidence vanished into smoke, an airfield used not for escape, but deployment. To an outsider, it looked like any other military base. Inside, it was a carefully engineered nightmare. The staff, over 3,000 personnel at its peak, were selected not just for skill, but for loyalty. Many were young doctors, researchers, and soldiers, drawn in by nationalism or blinded by ambition. Some were true believers, others simply obeyed. And the prisoners? They arrived in silence. Chinese resistance fighters, civilians swept up during raids, Russian captives, political dissidents, even a handful of Allied POWs, their presence denied, their identities erased. The guards had a word for them. Maruta. It means log, as if they were just timber to be processed. A cruel euphemism. Because Unit 731 was seen as a lumber mill for human lives. Men, women, children. They were tagged, numbered, and sent into corridors with no return. No trials, no charges. Only experimentation in the name of science. But not pure science. This was not about discovery. This was about dominance. What could the human body endure? How far could infection spread? How quickly could a village be exterminated without firing a shot? In the offices of Unit 731, these weren't moral questions. They were data points. There is no gentle way to describe what happened inside Unit 731. No way to soften it. No way to explain it without standing at the edge of what human cruelty is capable of. This is where the story becomes difficult and necessary. Inside the operating rooms of Unit 731, vivisections were performed on living subjects, without anesthesia. Organs were removed, lungs dissected, limbs amputated, all while the victims remained conscious. Why? To observe the real-time effects of disease and trauma, subjects were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Once the symptoms set in, fever, bleeding, necrosis, their bodies were opened to see how the infection moved through their organs. Some were locked in pressure chambers to test the limits of the human body at high altitudes. Others were exposed to extreme cold until their limbs froze solid, then beaten with hammers to study frostbite. Women, many of them pregnant, were infected and dissected. Some were impregnated by doctors as part of the study. Babies were delivered, only to be experimented on too. There was no line these men wouldn't cross, no code, no conscience, only curiosity, weaponized. What they learned, they documented. Temperature charts, blood samples, autopsy photos, Science, they claimed, but science built on screams. The prisoners, the logs, were not statistics. They were people with names, families, lives. And yet, in the cold calculus of Unit 731, they were disposable. Fuel for a war machine that fed on suffering. At history's shadow, we refuse to turn away. Because remembrance is resistance, and silence is complicity. If this part of the story moved you, even disturbed you, consider sharing it. Because while these voices were silenced, we can still speak for them. The atrocities within Unit 731's walls were only the beginning. Once the theories were tested in secret, they were unleashed upon the world. Shirō Ishii didn't just want data. He wanted results. He wanted to see how his biological weapons worked, not on individuals, but on entire populations. Japanese aircraft flew over Chinese villages, dropping ceramic bombs filled with fleas infected with the bubonic plague. Wells were tainted with cholera. Rice and flour supplies were poisoned with typhoid and anthrax. The villagers never stood a chance. They weren't soldiers. They weren't warned. They were test subjects, unaware, unarmed, and utterly helpless. Entire towns were infected. Men, women, children, coughing, bleeding, dying within days. Hospitals overflowed, corpses piled up in streets. There was no medicine, no aid, only silence and death. And these weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic. Ishii's team carefully mapped infection zones, tracked spread rates, calculated mortality. Every outbreak was a data point. Every village, a petri dish. It is estimated that up to 400,000 people may have died as a direct result of Unit 731's biological attacks. That's not war. That's genocide, by scientific means. And yet, the world barely noticed. The fog of World War II was thick, filled with headlines from Europe, bombs over London, bodies in Auschwitz. And in the East, a different kind of horror was playing out, in silence. This is the part of history many never hear. The part buried under diplomacy, denial, and decades of silence. But here on History's Shadow, we pull back the veil, because the truth doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. In August 1945, as the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's imperial ambitions collapsed. The war was lost, and Unit 731 had a secret to protect. The men who had conducted some of the worst atrocities in modern history didn't panic. They followed orders. Documents were burned. Test subjects executed. Buildings were demolished. Labs emptied. Bodies erased. They didn't just want to cover their tracks. They wanted to vanish, to leave no proof, no records, no witnesses. But the stain was too deep. Some evidence remained, ruins, photographs, and the memories of the few who survived. When Allied forces reached Manchuria, they uncovered fragments of the horror, scattered equipment, medical instruments, journal pages filled with chilling precision. And then came the interrogations. One name stood out again and again: Shirō Ishii, the mastermind, the architect, the man behind the mask of science. Surely he would face justice. But justice, in post-war politics, is rarely pure. The United States, eager to gain an edge in the rising Cold War, made a decision. A deal. In exchange for Unit 731's research, Ishii and his men were granted immunity. No trials, no prison, no accountability. The knowledge, how to spread disease, how to kill silently, was deemed too valuable. The price? Silence, and the lives of thousands, reduced to footnotes in classified files. This wasn't justice. This was a transaction, one that betrayed the victims. one that rewrote history before the ink had even dried. If you believe history should be remembered, not rewritten, share this video. Let the silence end here, on history's shadow. After the war, the world watched as the Nuremberg trials brought Nazi war criminals to justice. Names like Mengele and Himmler became synonymous with evil, and history demanded they be held to account. But in the East, there was no Tokyo trial for Unit 731. No cross-examinations, no gallows, no judgment. The men of Unit 731 simply disappeared into the fabric of post-war Japan. Some became doctors in Tokyo hospitals. Others became professors, teaching future generations medicine built on murder. A few went into politics, influencing policy from behind the veil of respectability. And Shirō Ishii. He lived a quiet life in Tokyo, unprosecuted, untouched. He died in 1959, not in a prison cell, but in bed. The United States, having secured the data it wanted, helped bury the truth. Files were classified, names were scrubbed. When Japanese officials later denied Unit 731 ever existed, no one stepped forward to contradict them. There were no reparations, no apologies, no memorials. The victims were forgotten by history until they started speaking for themselves. Some survivors of Unit 731's field experiments and families of the dead began to speak out, to write, to protest. But the silence had already calcified into denial. Even Japanese textbooks omitted the events. Even museums were slow to acknowledge the truth. Even today, Unit 731 remains a taboo subject in Japan. What does it mean when evil is allowed to retire? What does it say about justice when the victims are erased and the perpetrators get tenure? At History's Shadow, we tell the stories others are afraid to face. We shine light into the dark, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Subscribe if you believe in truth without compromise, because remembrance is power. For decades, the grounds where Unit 731 once stood were left to rot, overgrown, forgotten, choked by weeds and denial. But silence has a limit, and even the dead leave behind echoes. In the 1980s, a few brave journalists and scholars began to pull at the threads. They tracked down former personnel. They interviewed aging villagers who remembered the outbreaks, the planes, the sickness, the disappearances. They found the shadows, and those shadows began to speak. In Harbin, China, what remained of the compound was uncovered. Foundations of vivisection chambers, trenches filled with discarded bones, charred remnants of research logs, some pages still legible. Each discovery was like a whisper from beneath the rubble. Not just evidence, but testimony. A child's shoe, a medical restraint, a name carved into a prison wall. The voices that had been silenced, the civilians, the soldiers, the test subjects, were now telling their story without words. In 2015, China opened the Unit 731 Museum on the ruins of the old complex. It stands not as a spectacle, but as a memorial. Dark, cold hallways lead visitors past surgical tools, rusting prison doors, glass cases holding jars once filled with infected organs. There are no dramatics, no embellishments, just the truth, brutal, stripped bare, undeniable. Every visitor walks through the same narrow corridors. Every eye meets the same photographs. Every step echoes with the same question. How did this happen? And perhaps more urgently, why did no one stop it? At History's Shadow, we walk those halls in every episode, not literally, but in purpose. We preserve the names. We amplify the whispers. We refuse to let the dust settle over the dead. Because history is not a collection of dates. It's a chorus of human choices and their consequences. History isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. And when it comes to Unit 731, forgetting was deliberate. For years, Japan's government deflected. Officials denied the extent of the atrocities. Some denied Unit 731's existence altogether. In classrooms, students never learned about it. In textbooks, it became a footnote or disappeared entirely. No trials, no reparations, no national apology. To acknowledge the past is to take responsibility. And for those in power, responsibility threatens reputation. But denial has consequences. Survivors, aging and fading, spent decades fighting for recognition. Chinese families still suffer the scars of poisoned wells, lost generations, inherited trauma. Scholars demanding openness faced backlash and censorship. And yet, every year, new evidence surfaces. A photograph tucked in an attic, a journal found in a soldier's estate sale, a survivor finally willing to speak. The truth, no matter how long buried, refuses to die quietly. There are still people today who argue that Unit 731 was justified, that it was a wartime necessity, that it saved lives by advancing science. But that's not memory. That's propaganda. Memory without truth is hollow. Denial dressed as patriotism is still a lie. When nations refuse to face their darkest moments, they risk repeating them. Silence becomes permission. Erasure becomes complicity. In Harbin, the wind still moves through the ruins of Unit 731. The concrete is cracked, the metal rusted, but the silence, it speaks louder than ever. This place, once built to erase humanity, now stands to preserve it. Walk through the corridors of the museum, and you'll find no spectacle, no sensationalism, just the raw evidence of cruelty, and the names of those it consumed. Names without graves, lives without markers, stories nearly lost to time, but not anymore. The men of Unit 731 are gone, but their legacy remains, not in honor but in warning. They remind us of what happens when science loses its soul, when nationalism poisons morality, when human beings are reduced to data points, to logs, to objects. They remind us that the worst crimes don't require monsters, only men with power, and the silence of those who know better. This was episode 1 of History's Shadow. You've just heard the story of Unit 731, Japan's buried truth. If it moved you, if it unsettled you, if it opened your eyes, then don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, share this episode, and subscribe. Because the more we shed light on the dark, the fewer shadows are left to hide in. And we have many more shadows to explore. From covert CIA experiments to forgotten genocides, from state secrets to erased resistance movements, history's shadow is where the truth comes with scars. I'm your narrator, and I'll be here in the shadows, waiting for you. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, the shadows hold the truth.